Good evening, matinee webinarലേക്ക് എല്ലാവർക്കും സ്വാഗതം. Today we have a distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Mr. Ray Mathias. He is from USA and he is the teacher of our math team. And he was a teacher or health educator for last 3 years. And he retired in the year of 2007. And he is an expert in dysfunctional emotional states, and he is using different therapies like ABC therapy, CBT, REBT, and he has developed many toolkits for mental emotional survival. And I'm very proud to invite you, sir, to this webinar.
Well, thank you.
So you
Glad to be here. So should I start my presentation now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, the title is Optimal Mental Health. To give credit where credit's due, this is largely based on the work of Dr. Albert Ellis, which is Rational Emotive Behavioral Therapy, REBT, or Rational Emotive Behavioral Education, REBE. Now, Dr. Ellis, I said this in our introduction, Dr. Ellis had a quote that I always like: therapy should be educational, and it often isn't. And education can be very therapeutic. And I very much believe in the second part of that. And I think if we give people the right mental and emotional tools, they can and will do a lot to help themselves. Now, one of the first things I always try to do is with students or clients is to help them recognize and appreciate the important role of emotion plays in everyday lives. And I like to hyphenate the word emotion because it's really energy to move. And it's energy to move to help us deal with threats and get what we want and need. Now, one of my contributions to the field of psychology has been what I call the think, feel, do thermostat model. And I got the idea from staying in cheap hotels in the US when I travel, and they have these little thermostats on the wall where you can push the dial up and down to just the temperature. Now, we have objective ways to measure temperature, like degrees, Fahrenheit or degrees Celsius. But we also use subjective terms like cool, warm, and hot. So we also, for emotions, we also use things like calm and indifference, frustration, irritation, annoyance, and anger. So this is the way I set up the thermostat for feel, one example. Now, whenever you look at emotions, you always want to look at the FID, frequency, intensity, and duration. And so you can add that into the diagram. So you can have a low or high frequency, intensity, and duration of calm and indifference, frustration, irritation, annoyance, or anger. And these are not only quantitatively different emotions, but they're qualitatively too. And I'll explain why later. Now, so this is what it would look like. As the perceived threat goes up, you generate more and more emotions. So if there's a very low threat or no threat, it's easy to stay calm. But once the threat becomes higher, you generate frustration, irritation, annoyance, or concern. And if the perceived threat is even higher, then you go up to anger and anxiety. And literally, anger and anxiety are a fight or flight response. Now, I like to hyphenate the word responsible as well, because what it really means is able to respond in the best possible way. And the word responsibility means the ability to respond in the best possible way. Now, one of my favorite rules as a teacher was there are two ways to make something you don't like worse: do nothing and overreact to it. And too often people do the latter. So based on that, I built the do part of the think, feel, do thermostat, where you can either do nothing, you can respond in the best possible way, or you can react or overreact. And one of the problems, as I mentioned when we were talking earlier, is I realized from very early in my career, the real problem with my students was that they generated what I call a dysfunctional amount of emotion, which by that I mean more than is necessarily helpful, more than they want, more than they want to have, more than they know what to do with, and a type and frequency, intensity, and duration that works against them instead of for them. One of the tenets I was taught in REBT is a person's behavior will tend to follow his or her emotions toward his or her life events. So I can start to construct the feel and do part of the thermostat. So as the thermostat goes up and you go from frustration, irritation, annoyance, and concern to anger and anxiety, you become more likely to react or overreact rather than simply respond. Now, so a dysfunctional amount of emotion makes people more reactive and less response able. Now, one of the real important things I always try to impress upon teachers or anyone, people need to be in the right mental and emotional place to do a bunch of things that are very helpful, to access and act on helpful advice and information, to consider consequences before acting, to act in accordance with their personal values and to function at levels they are capable of and make the best possible choices. Now, we've never done enough to teach people how to get there and stay there, and we still don't. And that's one of the things I try to advocate for, doing more mental health education. This is the way I do the field thermostat for sadness and depression, regret and shame, remorse and guilt. And with loneliness, there's no real, it's just a question of how much, what kind of frequency, intensity, and duration you have for it. Now, it may be hard to think of depression, shame, guilt, loneliness as energy to move, because people think about when they have depressed, they get low energy, but they have the same effect on behavior as anger and anxiety do. For example, if someone has regret, remorse, sadness, and loneliness, that might motivate them to reach out to other people, talk to others, and get help. But if they experience shame, guilt, depression, or high frequency, intensity, and duration of loneliness, they're more likely to do things, react to life by doing things like getting drunk, abusing drugs, or even suicide. Now, this is the way the whole think, feel, and do thermostat would look, okay, if you put it all together. So as you turn your thermostat up, you're more likely to react and overreact to life, and you're more likely to make mistakes. Now, reacting and overreacting is kind of a mix of double-edged sword, because there's a saying that he who hesitates, well, I can't remember, he who hesitates is lost. But then on the other hand, so many people make mistakes in their life and do a lot of things that aren't helpful when they react or overreact. Now, one of the things I used to like tell my students is anger, anxiety, depression, shame, guilt, and loneliness can make otherwise smart, well-informed people do stupid things. Now, one of the basic psychological principles is people start and continue to do things because it serves a purpose in their life. Well, one of the things is true is that, excuse me, a dysfunctional amount of emotion gives purpose to many unhealthy, self-defeating, self-destructive behaviors like smoking, drinking, using drugs, dropping out of school, or even suicide. Now, one of the things Dr. Ellis used to always do is distinguish between getting better and feeling better, right? And the whole goal is to try to get better instead of just temporarily feeling better, which means to generate a more functional amount of emotion to become more response able. Now, there are a lot of ways to temporarily feel better. Some are healthy, like yoga, meditation, and exercise, and many aren't, like smoking, drinking, and using drugs. Getting better means permanently reducing the frequency, intensity, and duration of troublesome emotions. Now, the only real way to get better is to change the way you think. So that's why we emphasize so much on the cognitive aspect of people's lives. Now, the ultimate problem, though, is not just that people generate too much emotion. The reason they do that is because they too often imagine threats where they don't exist, or magnify ones that do out of proportion to reality. And we have a lot of that going on in the United States right now, in the political realm, where people are imagining all these threats that really don't exist. The work of Dr. Albert Ellis, REBT and RBE, does a great job. They both do a great job of showing us how we produce or imagine threats where they don't exist, or magnify ones that do out of proportion to reality. And more importantly, how to stop doing that. And that's what I'm going to explain later in the presentation. Now, I want to say a few things quickly about anger, though. Anger is emotional nitroglycerin. Okay, that's the way, evolutionary wise, that's the way it's intended to be, to help you get into fight or flight, save your life. Unfortunately, when people get into fight or flight, it also causes a lot of needless conflict, suffering, and even death. Now, because it's emotional nitroglycerin, it's just as hard to handle as the real thing. Now, that's why I believe anger management is a fool's errand. We hear about anger management. People go to anger management. We should strive for anger prevention, because once somebody gets angry, it's kind of like the Incredible Hulk. Once Dr. David Banner hulks out, it's havoc. Okay, it's chaos. And the only way that stops is when he stops being angry. Now, one of the other things that's important to know about anger, I like to share with people, is people like being angry. They don't like being sad, depressed, and other things, but they like being angry because it gives them a false sense of power, righteousness, permission, and protection. And I'll explain each one of these a little bit. So for those who feel powerless, like students I have who feel powerless in school, anger is like an anabolic steroid. It just pumps them up. That's why they like it. Now, my mentor used to always ask, ever met an, as far as righteousness, he used to always ask, ever met an angry person who thought they were wrong? And of course, the answer to that is no. Now, so anger can make, just like I said before, a dysfunctional emotion. Anger can make otherwise smart people do stupid things. Now, the other thing is, as long as people stay angry, they don't have to feel other feelings they don't like having, like shame, guilt, and depression. Now, when we used to talk about anger in class, people would often ask my mentor, a guy named Terry London, who's the executive director of the Chicago Institute, aren't there times when it's good to get angry? And his answer was always the same. Anything you can do when you're angry, you can do better when you're not. Now, there might be times when getting angry might save lives, but there's so many other times when it leads to needless conflict, suffering, and death. Now, talk about anxiety a little bit too before we move on. We like to call anxiety a figment of imagination. And what we mean by that is it's about things that could happen, but haven't happened yet and often never do. So one way to define an anxiety disorder is that someone spends too much time in their imagination, too much time in the future tense. Now, so one of the simple strategies I like to offer people is called staying in the now. It basically, you get in the habit of saying to yourself, whenever you start to feel anxious, whatever it is you're imagining is going to happen, you say that might happen, but it hasn't happened yet. And if it does, I'll deal with it, just like others have, just like I have other things in the past. It's a very simple but effective strategy called staying in the now. Now, one of the first things we always try to teach people to do, encourage people to do, is consciously choose to have what Ellis used to call unconditional self-acceptance, which turns out to be USA. Now, the reason USA is so important is it helps defend against shame. Now, if you understand how shame comes about, it's easy to see why it's such a big problem. Shame comes from when you believe you're not living up to your own or other people's expectations. Well, we all have many expectations placed on us from the time we're born, and they just keep increasing as we go through life and place many more on ourselves. Well, what that means is plenty of opportunities to be told or believe we aren't living up to the expectations we have and to feel shame. So there's a lot of that going on out there. I used to have an acronym for explaining what troubled and troublesome students deal with, and I called it ESP, which means they struggle with estrangement, they struggle with shame, and they struggle with powerlessness. And that's what we have to work on in order to help them. Now, Shakespeare said expectation is the root of all heartache. And there's a lot of truth to that. And I'll talk more about this later. Now, one of the things I want to say about expectations real quickly here is one of the ways people hurt themselves is they go from simply wanting, preferring, or desiring to do something, which might cause concern, because if you want to do something, there's always a possibility it may not turn out. So you have concern. But what they do is they turn their think thermostat up to thinking they need to do something and they have to do it. And that elevates concern into anxiety. And that's how you create a lot of stress. Now, anxiety can impair performance. And the reason that does is if you plug into your flight mode, it's harder to function at the level you're capable of or want to, because you're too busy fighting that urge to flee the situation. Now, so what also happens if you do that before a life event is after a life event, instead of just simply wishing you had done something differently or better, you have regret or remorse, you start to do what Ellis used to call shooting on yourself, and you generate shame or guilt. Now, in doing that, you can get into a vicious cycle where you have anxiety, before something because you're telling yourself you have to do it instead of just want to. And then you get into shooting on yourself afterward. You get into a vicious cycle, go back and forth. And then everyday challenges can start to become quite threatening. And that's why kids shut down in school and sometimes drop out. Now, being told or believing you're not living up to expectations is a threat to what we call the symbolic self. The symbolic self is the person we want to be and be seen as by others. Now, the problem we face is that the brain treats a perceived threat to the symbolic self the same as a threat to life and limb. So it's one way, one of many ways that people manufacture a threat where one that need not exist. For example, if somebody calls me a name, that's not a threat to life and limb, but people elevate it to the same level as a threat to life and limb in their brain. Now, shame can be both what Ellis used to call a primary and secondary disturbance. It can be the primary feeling someone seeks relief from through things like drugs, alcohol, dropping out of school, or even suicide. It's also can be a secondary disturbance. What he meant by that was shame makes people want to keep what they think, feel, or do, or who they are perhaps, a secret, okay? It makes them less likely to seek or accept help that's available. And that's why Ellis emphasized working on addressing shame before we do anything else. He used to say, sum all this up by saying shame blocks change. Now, keeping secrets can have a real tragic outcome, including suicide. I'll take a few moments just to explain why. Because what that allows, by keeping secrets, what it allows them to do is they repeat irrational thoughts to themselves, like what we used to say, a broken record. And without the kind of challenge they would get if they said it out loud. If they say some of these things out loud, somebody say, wait a minute, that's not true. But if I repeat it to myself, there's no challenge. And what happens is when you repeat things over and over again to yourself, simple opinions or even lies about themselves, others, and life start to seem like facts, givens, or truths, and simple imaginations start to seem like reality. And we've all heard of the big lie concept, where the World War II Nazis used to say people will believe a big lie before they believe a little one. You just have to keep repeating it, which is true. And I'll explain why at the end of the presentation. It has to do with what we call ruts in the brain. Now, so what happens, these facts, givens, and truths or realities can become what I call the irrational logic of unhealthy, unhelpful, even self-destructive behavior. What I mean by that is what they say and do makes life worse for them and others, which is irrational. Why would you do that? But it makes sense to them because of what they've come to believe. Now, so the solution to all this is to try to teach and encourage people to have what we call unconditional self-acceptance. And what that means to me is choosing to see anything you think, feel, say, or do, have in the past or might in the future, as part of being human, and understandable given what your life experiences have been and what you have to deal with at the moment. Now, part of being human to me means you'll never be the first or last human being in history to think, feel, say, or do something, or make a particular mistake, or, for example, be LGBTQ. You'll always have a lot of company. Now, understandable means that if you put other human beings through the exact same life experiences, they'd probably end up thinking, feeling, saying, and doing much the same. Some might fare better, others might fare worse, but most would probably be much the same. Now, understandable also means that no one's perfect. Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone does the best they can at the time, given what they've been through and what they have to deal with at the moment. Now, Dr. Ellis used to say we're all FHBs, or fallible human beings. What he meant by that, or what I took it to mean, was who at times think, feel, say, and do things that make our own lives and sometimes the lives of others worse instead of better. Now, also, we encourage people to consciously choose to have unconditional other acceptance. And the world, and our country and the world, could use a big dose of UOA. Now, that means to choose to look at what others think, feel, say, or do, have in the past or might in the future, as part of being human also, and understand, well, given what their life experiences have been, which may have been much different than our own. Now, we can still dislike or disagree with what others think, feel, say, or do. It just helps temper our mental and emotional response to what others, excuse me, think, feel, say, or do that we don't like or disagree with. Now, the way I used to explain this is I always suggested we should all kind of tongue in cheek, I used to say we should all come with a movie of our lives that others have to watch in full when they meet us. Now, and the question would be, if they watched our movie, would they see the understandable reasons we think, feel, say, or do what we do now? And would we do the same if we watched their movies? And I think the answer to that is an unequivocal yes. Now, the next thing I think it's important for people to do is start listening to the way you and others talk about your and their feelings and how they come about. Now, for example, you hear people say things like this: that really ticks me off, that really stresses me out, that's really depressing. He or she hurt my feelings, that really makes me feel guilty, that puts a lot of pressure on me. He or she makes me so happy. Now, it has to do with locus of control. Locus of control is where we see our feelings as coming from, what we see as the cause of them. Now, you can have an internal, or sometimes they use the word inner, or you can have an external or outer locus of control. The vast majority of people walking the planet have an external locus of control. What that means is they wrongly see what others say and do, and what happens as the actual cause of how they feel. Now, if you wrote a formula for how most people look at things, it would be something like event equals feelings, or the event directly somehow causes how I feel. There's a bunch of reasons why that's understandable that people look at things that way. Part of it is because feelings tend to come so quickly after something happens that people have a hard time imagining there's some intervening variable. Now, there's actually a formula, though, for the way, a very simple formula for the way life really unfolds from moment to moment. And that formula is event plus thoughts equals feelings and behavior. And if you put it into words, what it means is anything that others say or do or it happens is an event in our lives. And thoughts cause feelings, not events. Now, some people will argue with that because they say, well, sometimes you have a feeling so quickly, there can't be anything in between, but there always is something in between. The brain can process so fast, and it has to for survival. Now, the third thing is behavior will tend to follow a person's emotions toward his or her life events. And the last thing I always like to say is attitude's always the father of behavior. Now, this formula is just like that one we learned in algebra. I think I learned it in 5th grade, where A plus B equals C, and A is a constant and B is a variable. If A stays the same and you change B, C changes. Well, if the event stays the same and you change your thoughts about it, your feelings and behavior will change, perhaps for the better or worse, depending on what you think. Now, Dr. Ellis had his ABC theory of emotions. And basically, he says that A is the activating event, B is your beliefs about the event, yourself, others, and life, and C are the consequences, what you feel and do as a consequence of what you believe about yourself, others, life, and the activating event. Now, just so you don't think this is some new idea that Ellis came up with in the 1950s, in almost 2,000 years ago, Epictetus, which was one of Ellis's favorite Stoic philosophers, said men are disturbed not by things, but by the view, I can't see them, they take of them. Okay. Now, the problems with having an external locus of control, I'm going to list a couple. One, it puts you at the seeming and needless mercy of others and your life events. Two, it gives others seeming power, and I emphasize the word seeming, over your emotional destiny, how you're going to feel in the next couple of seconds, minutes, hours, days, months, years, that others really don't have. They don't have that real power. Now, and you give away the real power that you do have to control your emotional destiny. And all this typically causes you to feel worse than is helpful or necessary. And it can cause you to feel like a victim, powerless to feel better. It also implies that others or life must change for the better for you to feel better. Well, my question's always been, what if you never do? What if those things never do get better? Does that mean you're doomed to feel bad forever? Now, and the last thing it does is it creates a perceived threat where it really doesn't exist. Because you get angry at someone because you believe they made you feel bad instead of you upsetting yourself. Now, and the last most important thing is it causes you to miss many opportunities to feel or get better. Now, one of the things I like to encourage people to think about is we all have a host of cognitive choices we make all the time. You're making these right now listening to me. How you look at things, what meaning you attach to what does happen or what you hear other people say and do, what you focus on at any given moment, what you compare things to, what you remember about the past at any given moment, what you imagine will happen in the future, what you expect of yourself, others in life, and how much importance you attach to what does happen, and what you spend your time thinking about. Now, there's a fact of life, and that's that there's always more than one way to look at or think about anything, or more than one way to make each one of these choices. When I get up in the morning, there's things I can focus on when I look in the mirror that make me feel really bad. And there's other things that make me feel, you're not doing too bad for 72. Now, some ways you could look at things or think about things or make those choices will make you feel better. Others will make you feel worse. Some ways will make it easier to cope or deal with what you don't like. Others will make it harder. But you always have a choice. And choice is your real power and control over your emotional destiny. Now, the problem is people often have what Dr. Ellis called automatic irrational beliefs, or automatic, what Dr. David Amen calls automatic negative thoughts. And he likes to say people have ant problems. Now, these beliefs, and because the reason I mention these, because these beliefs and thoughts can cause you to lose sight of the fact that you have all these choices available to you every moment of your life. Now, so here's how it goes. Thoughts cause feeling, not events. There's always more than one way to look at things or make other cognitive choices. That means you always have a choice as to how you do. Therefore, it's your choice how you want to feel. Okay. Now, so that's one thing my friend told me many, many years ago. And another one I learned, I was reading an article about cardiac rehabilitation. And in that cardiac rehab program, they taught people no one upsets you, you upset yourself. Now, this is called developing an internal locus of control. And it's one of the most empowering things we can do for ourselves and teach others to do for themselves. I used to also try to encourage my students to say, I'm responsible for how I feel, not others. It's not their job to make me feel good, it's mine. Now, but I also want to mention our default philosophical position is always USA, which means anything we think, feel, say, or do is part of being human and understandable given what our life experience have been and what we have to deal with at the moment. And what you have to do is strike a balance between these two. I kind of think of the old doctor scale before we had digital, they would strike a balance between so you'd get the weight. So to avoid shame that can block change, sometimes you want to go with the default philosophy that anything you think, feel is part of being human and understandable. But if you want to get better, you have to go with it's your choice how you look at things and how you want to feel. That's the only way to get better. Now, I think Ellis used to talk a lot about semantic precision and correctness, and he said it was very important. So you have to start recognizing when you and others talk about feelings and how they come about in a semantically or scientifically incorrect or imprecise way. All these sayings right here, he ticks me off, those are all incorrect and imprecise, okay? Because that's not how things really work. And you want to start practicing talking about feelings and the way they actually come about or talk about them in semantically and scientifically precise and correct ways. For example, no one upsets me, I upset myself. I'm making myself nervous. I'm depressing myself about that. Pressure comes from inside me, not outside. I'm driving myself, for example, a teacher always saying, kids drive me crazy. I'm driving myself crazy. No one can make me happy and I can't make others happy. So those are some examples of semantically and scientifically correct and precise ways of talking. Now, particular one I want to talk about is that hurt my feelings. And the way I kind of challenge this, have you ever seen a feeling? Not what someone looks like when they have a feeling, but an actual feeling. Well, of course you can't because it's an electrobiochemical event in the body. Have you ever held a feeling in your hands? Of course not. So if you can't see a feeling and you can't hold it in your hand, how do you hurt a feeling? So really that idea of hurting feelings is nonsensical, okay, at least in my mind. Now, one of the things I think back to sometimes when we were kids, they used to teach us sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Well, nowadays we're telling kids words hurt. So don't do those things to kids. Don't say that to other people. Well, the problem is which is true. And the way I like to explain it is words in our formula is just an event. And the hurt is a feeling. Well, what's in between is what we think about others and what they say and do. So that's really what causes hurt or doesn't. And I like to think back to when I was a kid. I have a vivid memory of some kid being called all kinds of names and him sitting there and saying with a smile on his face, I know you are, but what am I? I know you are, but what am I? And he felt invincible and powerful and in control. And nobody could hurt him at all. But once he started thinking, how dare you say that about me? Then the hurt and anger overwhelmed him. Okay, but it's not because of what happened, what the kids were saying, is because of what he chose to think at the moment. So a semantically precise way to talk about this is sometimes, but not always, because of what we understandably choose to think about what others say and do, we understandably make ourselves feel what we call hurt. Now, this is kind of the basis for something I developed, I call a mental emotional karate, which means learning to defend yourself mentally and emotionally against verbal and cyber attacks, the way we teach some to defend themselves against physical attacks in real karate classes. And one of the quotes I like to use in there is from Eleanor Roosevelt: no one can make you feel inferior or bad without your consent or permission. Now, the other one is from Dr. Viktor Frankl, who was a Holocaust survivor. He said, everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's own attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And the short version of that is your last freedom is your attitude. Now, I like to talk about helping kids in school, for example, with bullying, to help them get what I call a mental and emotional black belt in mental and emotional karate. And basically it would be to get them to the point where their response to attacks would be, you can think, feel, say, or do whatever you want to about me. That's your choice. But it's my choice how I look at and feel about myself, what I do, who I am. You don't get to make those choices for me unless I let you, and I choose not to. Now, if every kid got to that place, mentally and emotionally, bullying would be no problem. It's a way of what I call hardening the targets instead of trying to stop the bullying, because we're never able to do that. Now, another part of developing an internal locus of control is to learn and remind yourself what you do and don't control, and focus on and work with what you do control instead of what you don't. Now, I used to like to draw what I call a circle of conflict. I take that formula or draw a circle on a chalkboard, and then I would split it into two. And one part would be you, one part would be them. And then I would write that formula twice around the circle. So whatever somebody else says or does is an event for you. And then you generate some thoughts about that, and then perhaps feelings like anger, and then you say or do something, and that becomes a new event for them. And then they do the same thing. They generate thoughts about that, and perhaps more anger, and then say or do something back. And this goes around a circle like this, and that's how conflicts can escalate very quickly. Well, my question for my students used to always be, which half of the circle do we have control over? And I never had a single student ever in my entire 33 years get this wrong. We only have control over our half of the circle. Now, but when we're in situations with people, many people think, act, and talk as if they do control and can control what others think, feel, say, and do. But the reality is we can only control what we think, feel, say, and do. And that's a big enough job for most people. Now, most people spend too much time and energy trying to control things they can't, like what others think, feel, say, and do. Now, you can influence other people, but you can't control it. In the end, they can think, feel, say, and do whatever they want to. And they spend too little time and energy trying to control what they can, which is what we think, feel, say, and do. Now, and the more you try to control things you can, the more out of control your life will feel, and the more anger, anxiety, and depression you'll experience. The more you focus on and work with what you do control, the more in control you'll feel. Now, there's an old serenity prayer or poem where grant me courage to change things I can, the serenity to accept things I can't, and more importantly, the wisdom to know the difference. Now, another thing, part of developing an internal locus of control is to learn to not take unnecessary responsibility for how others make themselves feel. The reason that's important, one, is that if you take unnecessary responsibility for how others make themselves feel, it makes it difficult for you to negotiate on your own behalf and make the healthiest choice. Some others may use it against you or even to manipulate you. Now, and it's one more way that people imagine or manufacture a perceived threat, because you think someone will leave you because they're upset with you and you made them feel bad. Well, that's an imagined threat. Now, excuse me. The way to reason your way through this is anything we say or do is just an event for other people. They have those same cognitive choices we have. Therefore, it's their choice how they want to feel. No one upsets them, they upset themselves. We are responsible for what we say and do, but not necessarily for how others make themselves feel about such things, because they can upset themselves as little or as much as they want to. Now, I don't want people to not care how others feel. That's too little. But I don't want people to walk around thinking it's my fault they feel that way, because that's too much. So somewhere in between is the way they feel is understandable, but it's their choice how they want to feel, just like it's my choice how I want to feel. Now, the next thing I think is important to teach people is to recognize when you and others engage in irrational thinking. I like to call these cognitive missteps. Now, Dr. Ellis identified 4 basic types of irrational thinking and called them demandingness, awfulizing, can't stand it-itis, and labeling and damning. Now, here's how I develop a think thermostat, okay? Just like we do with hot, cool, warm, hot. We can not care about something. You could sort of not care about it or really not care about it. And you could start to want something and sort of want it or really want it. Excuse me. It's morning. Or you could think you need it, either sort of need it or really think you need it. Now, so this is what it would look like. Okay, I'll make sure I did. Somehow I moved the thing without trying. Now, the cognitive missteps, according to Dr. Ellis, or the problem, according to Dr. Ellis, is people start to think they need things they simply want, start to treat simple preferences and necessities, start to demand what they simply desire. Now, so they turn their thermostat from want, preference, and desires up to need, necessity, and demand. Now, and Dr. Ellis used to talk about a perceived need, which means someone thinks they need something, but it's not like air, water, and food. It's nice to have, but they can't live without it. They're not going to die if they don't get it. Now, this is a major way that people manufacture threats where they don't exist and magnify ones that might out of proportion to reality. Now, I used to teach my students 5 rules. Here's rule number 1. You have the right to want whatever you want. Everybody has that right. Rather than fight with people about whether they should want something or not, you just stipulate you have the right to want whatever you want. Rule number 2 is the bigger the difference between your expectations and reality, the bigger the perceived threat will be and the more emotion you'll automatically generate. Now, again, go back to Shakespeare's quote, expectation is the root of all heartache. Now, so if you don't care about something and then you don't get it or lose it or imagine doing either, there's little or no threat. But once you start to want, prefer, and desire something, then if you don't get it, lose it, or imagine doing either, there'll be a certain amount of threat. But if you turn your think thermostat up to need, necessity, and demand, now the threat becomes much better or bigger, larger when you don't get it or lose it or imagine doing either. So this is the way you set the whole think, feel, do thermostat up. Okay, by elevating your think thermostat up to need, necessity, and demand, you predispose yourself to be angry instead of frustrated, irritated, or annoyed, anxious instead of concerned, depressed instead of sad, have shame instead of regret, guilt instead of remorse, and a much higher frequency, intensity, and duration of loneliness, and more likely to react and overreact instead of respond in the best possible way. Now, I'm going to say a quick thing about loneliness. Loneliness is not caused by being alone. Being alone is just an event in the formula. It's what you think about being alone that actually causes loneliness, or doesn't. For example, if I don't care whether my wife is in my life or not, if she's not there, I won't feel lonely. On the other hand, if I want, prefer, and desire her to be with me and she's not, now I have a certain amount of loneliness. But if I think I need her, like I need air, water, and food, and demand that she be with me and then she's not, I'm going to have a much higher frequency, intensity, duration of loneliness. Now, the key point is people will even elevate their wants, preferences, and desires to the same level as air, water, and food in their own mind. That makes not getting what they want or losing it seem like suffocating, dying of thirst or hunger. Now, rule number 3, behavior intended to satisfy a perceived need to win out over behavior intended to satisfy a rational preference. Now, a quick example of that would be a person wants to quit smoking. Well, that's a rational preference for a whole bunch of reasons. He thinks and tells himself, I need a cigarette. I can't go all day without one. That would be a perceived need. My question would be, what are the odds he'll quit? Not very good. Now, rule number 4 is when people start to think they need things they simply want, can make otherwise smart people do stupid things. And the way I like to explain this is, if you were suffocating, what would you be willing to do to get air? And of course, the answer is anything. That's why trying to save a drowning person can be so dangerous to the rescuer. Now, if someone starts to think they need love, for example, like they need air, water, and food, what might they be willing to do to get it or keep it? And unfortunately, the answer is the same, anything. And that's what can make otherwise smart people do stupid things. Now, so you want to learn the next thing you want to do is learn how to correct irrational thinking in yourself and tactfully challenge it in others. Now, so one of the questions I always pose is, what do we really need? Do we need love, attention, approval, acceptance, sex, a boyfriend or girlfriend? Do we need those things like we need air, water, and food? Now, unfortunately, most people are taught Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that's what they'll cite as evidence that we do need all those things. Well, my point is, Maslow did call all those things need, but you notice that he put them at different levels. Love and belonging is not the same level as physiological or safety. Now, one of the other problems you face is popular music. You have songs like the Beatles. I always listen to this listen to something called 70s on 7, which channel 7 on XM, something like that, radio. And you have a song like All You Need Is Love. People memorize and sing these songs to themselves, and it literally brainwashes people into a point of view that, yeah, we need love, like we need air, water, and food. Well, here's the way I challenge it. We die in minutes, days, or weeks without air, water, food, respectively. Do we need love, acceptance, and approval like we need air, water, and food? Will we die if we don't get those things like we die when we don't get air, water, and food? Do we need those things or just want, prefer, and desire them? Are they needs or just nice things to have? Okay. Now, one of the problems we have a problem lately about the Me Too movement, where people were about women who were sexually assaulted. Well, they often talk about men doing sexual things, assaulting women sexually. It's all about power. No, it's not about power. It's about some man elevating sex to the level of need in his own mind, and then he uses his power to get that sex he thinks he needs instead of just simply wants. Now, the key thing is we can set our thermostats wherever we want to, but there will be predictable mental, emotional, and behavioral consequences for where we do set it. Now, let's talk about demands for a second. You can make demands of others, yourself, or life. Now, and which you make demands of often determines what feeling you get. For example, anger often comes from making demands of others that don't get met. Anxiety can come from making demands of yourself before a life event or making demands of life. Shame and guilt come from making demands of yourself after an event, and so can anger. And depression comes from making demands of life, and so can anger. Now, the essence of anger is everyone has to do what I want, be the way I want it to be. Everything has to be the way I want it to be. Well, my question always is, how old does that sound? It sounds like a 2 or 3-year-old throwing a temper tantrum, which is why Ellis used to say, anger is an adult throwing a temper tantrum. Now, let's look at some of the verbs people tend to use when they're making demands of themselves, others, in life. They use verbs like have to, can't, should, or shouldn't. And so the simple ways to dispute or challenge or question these beliefs is to ask a simple question. If you say they have to or they should do what I tell them to, well, my question is going to be, why do they have to? Do they have to, or you just want them to? And if you say they can't or shouldn't, I'm going to say, why can't they? They can't, or you just don't want them to. So basically what I'm asking you to do is, where do you want to set your think thermostat? Do you want to set it at want to and don't want to, or do you want to set it have to, can, should, or shouldn't? Because where you set it will ultimately have some predictable consequences, emotionally and behaviorally. Now, my grandfather taught me to answer these questions a long time ago. He used to always say, no one has to do anything except die and pay taxes. Well, he was half right, because a lot of people don't pay taxes. And the other thing that the other answer to the question, why can't they, is people can think, feel, say, and do whatever they want to. That's a fact of life. We see the evidence of that all the time. Now, I want to talk a second about pressure and anxiety. They're really stress and pressure. They're really anxiety. Now, and here's a simple model for how people create stress for themselves using the think, feel, do thermostat. They go from simply wanting to do something to thinking I have to. And you listen to people when they talk about being stressed out, they use the verb have to a lot in their thoughts and when they construct their comments. And that creates a lot of anxiety and high stress. And as I said earlier, they can get into a vicious cycle where before some life event, they'll be telling themselves they have to do something and generate anxiety. That impairs their performance. And then afterwards, they're more likely to should or shouldn't say should on themselves and say they should or shouldn't have done something and feel shame or guilt, which makes the next time more anxious, because now they're more likely to say I have to the next time, and they get into this vicious cycle. Now, the simple way to break out of that is to challenge the irrational belief, I have to. Well, why do you have to? You have to or just want to. Or if you say I can't, why can't you? You can't or just don't want to. Now, here's where you're really using this model visually, and they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. This is where we want students and athletes and everyone else to be at the very top of that section where I want to or I don't want to. I want to be at the very top of it. Now, one of the things you want to do here is you want to practice, rehearse these questions until they become automatic. And what happens then is these questions start to act like grammar check on a computer. As soon as you start to have an irrational belief, the challenge is right there and counteracting it. Now, demands often comes in the form of a question. For example, how dare you? I hear people say this all the time, or how could they do something like that? Well, unfortunately, the answer to that is easily. How could somebody talk to me like that? Well, it's easy. All I got to do is take a breath and let it rip. Now, I used to always tell my students, never ask a question for which you won't like the answer. And if you say, how dare they, how could they, that's one of those questions. Now, Ellis used to talk about shooting on yourself, others, in life. And basically, after a life event, by shooting on yourself, you're more likely to create shame and guilt. Whereas if you simply wished something didn't happen, you would create regret and remorse. Now, and Ellis used to, if you look at old film clips of Ellis, he used to always, you hear him say, stop shooting on yourself. And I remember I had a colleague who had what we called a nervous break, well, she called a nervous breakdown. When she came back, she talked to the faculty in a meeting, and she had a shirt on her. Her shirt said, I'm not going to shoot on myself today. And I used to, now, here's an example of how shooting on life causes depression. You know, if you wish, I wish this wasn't happening to me, I wish I didn't have to deal with this, you'd feel sadness, because you do. But if you tell yourself this shouldn't be happening to me, I shouldn't have to deal with this, you're more likely to be depressed. Now, Ellis used to call depression a quiet temper tantrum, because people basically demand that life not be the way it is, that it be better than it is. Now, I used to always tell my students, shooting on yourself, others in life just makes you feel shitty. Okay. Now, the second kind of irrational thinking was called awfulizing. There are a lot of things in life that are unpleasant, inconvenient, and uncomfortable to some degree. The mistake people make is they tell themselves it's awful instead of just unpleasant, inconvenient, and uncomfortable. They turn their think thermostat up to awfulize, which means the worst possible thing that could be happening to me at the moment. Now, my grandfather used to call that making a mountain. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. Now, this has to do with anxiety too, because there's a formula for anxiety. Catastrophize plus awfulize equal anxiety. First, you imagine something bad happening, and then you tell yourself it would be awful if that did happen. So one of the ways to short circuit anxiety is to come up with some effective coping statements to de-awfulize the imagined event. For example, it wouldn't be the end of the world. I've survived before and will again. If others can deal with it, so can I, or I've been through a lot worse. Now, rule number 5 is you have a right to like or dislike whatever you want to. The mistake people make is to turn their think thermostat from I don't like it to I can't stand it. Okay. And by doing that, they needlessly inflame themselves. So that's why Dr. Ellis called I can't stand it itis, because itis is the suffix for inflammation. Now, so by turning your think thermostat up to need, necessity, and demand, you predispose yourself to awfulizing and can't stand it itis. And the reason is very simple. If you were suffocating or dehydrating or starving, it would be awful and you couldn't stand it. And the proof would be that you die in minutes, days, or weeks. So by turning your think thermostat up and treating other things beside air, water, and food as needs, necessity, and demanding those things, you're more likely to awfulize and tell yourself you can't stand something. Now, as far as how to deal with awfulizing, one of my mentors was a school counselor named Mark Denny. He used to always say, when someone's awfulizing, the last thing they need is someone agreeing with them. And a lot of times that's what people will do. They'll agree with somebody who's awfulizing. Actually, in politics, it's called grievance politics, where a politician will agree with everybody who's awfulizing about their life events, and that's how they get their support. So the questions we ask with awfulizing is it awful or just unpleasant? Is it awful or just inconvenient? Is it awful or just uncomfortable? Now, you can set your thermostat wherever you want to, but there will be predictable emotional behavioral consequences for what we do. Now, a simple strategy I use with young kids, I use this with my young granddaughter, Rosie, who's 5 years old. I'll just say, Rosie, big deal or little deal? And she's learning to say little deal, Grandpa. And as soon as she says little deal, she calms down. But if she continues to make that a big deal and turn her think thermostat up, she's going to experience a lot of needless emotion in her life. Now, the question for can't stand it itis is very simple. You're telling me you can't stand it. You can't stand it or just don't like it. So basically, I'm asking you, where do you want to set your think thermostat? At inconvenient, uncomfortable, and unpleasant, or awful? At I don't like it or I can't stand it? Now, so the answers to these two questions are, it's not awful, it's just unpleasant or inconvenient or uncomfortable. A lot of things in life are. Or the other answer is, I can't stand it, I just don't like it. And that's my right as a human being to not like something. Now, the last form of rational thinking is called label and damning. Rule 5, remember, is you have a right to like or dislike whatever you want to. The mistake people make is to go from disliking someone's behavior to label and damning the person. And Ellis used to say label and damning is blatant overgeneralization. It's like calling an apple bad because it has a bruise. It's condemning the doer instead of the deed. Now, the questions you'd use to challenge that is, why are they stupid or whatever just because they did that? They're stupid or just did a stupid thing. A lot of people, smart people, do stupid things. They're stupid or just did something you don't like. They're stupid or just a fallible human being. And hopefully the answers people would learn to have are, they're not stupid just because they did that. They're not stupid, they just did a stupid thing. They're not stupid, they just did something I didn't like. They're not stupid, they're just a fallible human being like the rest of us. Now, I want to mention real quickly racism, because we're struggling with racism in the United States, and I'm sure this happens all over the world as well in different forms. What racism really is blatant overgeneralization. It's like using the apple metaphor. It's like saying this group has some bad apples, or every group has some bad apples, so the whole group is bad. That's an overgeneralization. And they say that person is part of that group, so he or she must be a bad apple. That's racism. It's an overgeneralization. One of the problems we have, and I think the reason we never get rid of this is and I don't think we teach people enough about this, we have some innate cognitive tendencies that tend to contribute to this. One is we all have an innate cognitive tendency to note and attend to differences between us and others. And the second one is to generalize or even overgeneralize about our experiences. So one of the ways I would suggest people are struggling with, well, what do we do about racism in schools? Well, my suggestion would be challenge the overgeneralization. Make people more, and also make people more aware of the innate cognitive tendencies to note and attend to differences and to generalize. And also create as much cognitive distance as you can. For example, very often when people serve in the military, someone might serve with someone who's LGBTQ and that person ends up saving their life. Well, all of a sudden, it's pretty hard to hate that person when they just saved your life. That's creating cognitive dissonance. Now, I also think the answer to this might be Venn diagrams. We were all taught where you have two circles two sets of things that overlap. Well, starting at the DNA anatomical physiological levels, we all have a lot more in common than ways we differ. And I think what we need to do is help people start identifying and focusing on things, all those things we human beings have in common, instead of those small number of ways we differ. Now, the next thing I try to encourage people to do is have a step-by-step approach to troublesome life events. When I was in math in high school, I remember them always telling us, if you approach problems in the same way all the time, you're more likely to get the right answer. And the same is true for approaching troubling life events. So Ellis came up with a 5-step process. A was activating event, B was your beliefs, C was the consequences of what you feel and do, D was to dispute or challenge those beliefs, and E was effective coping statement. Now, the activating event can either be step 1 or step 2, like what happened? Tell me what happened or what you're imagining could happen. Or you could go with how are you feeling right now, or how are you making yourself feel? But the important step is number 3, which is to identify your beliefs about yourself, others' life, and the event, and then to challenge and dispute those. That's step 4, which is just step 4, and then come up with some effective coping statements. Now, I used to add 3 other steps to this Ellis's model. One was F was for functional amount of emotion, which is not a step, but it's an outcome. And then I used to have G was generate options. Once you're in a better mental and emotional place, let's talk about some behavioral options. And finally, healthier, H is healthier, happier, and hopeful. Now, one of the other things I also urge people to do is practice using I messages or instead of you messages. This stems from something back in the 70s called teacher effectiveness training and parent effectiveness training. Now, you messages are things like orders, threats, commands, criticism, name calling. You messages are also called solution messages because by telling somebody what to do, you're attempting to take away a person's right to choose what they want to do with their own life. And that's why they don't work. I messages simply give information, what you want, what you like or dislike. And it leaves it up to the other person what they want to do about that. Now, there's a technique in REBT called put your behavior where you want your attitude to be, which means practice talking the way you want to think. So by using I messages instead of you messages, it will bring your think thermostat down from need, necessity, and demand to want, prefer, and desire. So instead of saying, you better do what I tell you to, a teacher says, I want you to stop doing that right now. So it brings their think thermostat down, which will bring their emotional thermostat or feel thermostat down as well. So it's a way to put your behavior, it's called putting your behavior where you want your attitude to be. Now, last thing I want to talk about is why it's hard to change the way we think, feel, say, and do things, and what it takes to make change. And the way I described this, I had a neuroscientist come and talk to us at an institute one day as a teacher, and she talked about ruts. And she said, whenever we practice thoughts, feelings, or behaviors, we create ruts in our brain. And those ruts in our brain are just like real ruts in dirt roads. And a lot of kids, for example, do dirt biking and off-roading and stuff. And I do a lot of that out in the Southwest of America. And the ruts in our brain are just like the real ruts in roads. They're easy to slip into, hard to stay out of, and hard to get out once you're in them. Now, ruts can make thoughts and feelings and behaviors automatic, which can be a good thing. It's a double-edged sword. You know, I know the addition tables and subtraction tables. I learned those as a kid. Well, that allows me to do math in my head. A lot of kids nowadays can't do that. But it makes, having ruts makes simple thoughts, I'm sorry, skip one. Ruts make thoughts, feelings, and behaviors automatic. And what happens then is simple opinions about ourselves, others, and life start to seem like facts, givens, or truths. simple imaginations start to seem like reality. You know, I always say perception is reality. Well, it's really not. People just think it is. Ruts can be helpful or unhelpful things to have. It depends on what thoughts, feelings, behaviors they lead to. Now, the key point, though, is once you create ruts in your brains, you can never get rid of them. There's a thing called pruning, but it doesn't really make much difference. You can only make new ones. So what that means is the way you do that is by practicing and rehearsing new ways of thinking, feeling, and saying and do things until they become ruts. And hopefully they can compete with our old ways of thinking, feeling, saying, and do things. But the catch is you can always slip into old ruts. And you probably will. That's part of being human. And knowing about ruts is part of helping us to choose to have USA or UOA. So I can accept what somebody else does, even if I want them to change, I want them to think, feel, say, and do things better, but they slip into their old ruts and maybe they go back to drinking, smoking, whatever, behaving in some unhealthy way. I can have unconditional other acceptance if I remember about ruts. And I can do the same thing with myself. If I'm trying to change, I'm going to slip. And I'm going to slip back in. You know, I ran groups for kids, troubled kids at my wife's school. And sometimes they'd come in hanging their head because they had a bad week. And they'd tell me about it. I say, look, you're just a human being. You slipped into your ruts just like everybody else does. That happens. Let's figure out a way to keep you from slipping into those ruts next week. So that pretty much finishes my presentation. I mentioned earlier to Doctor that there's a book I have out there. The latest one is Look, It's Your Choice How You Want to Feel. It really is. Here's why. Now, I'm not trying to make money off this. I just want to spread this word. I can get up to 500 copies. It's available at $8.99 US on Amazon, but I can get copies at $3.15, and I can get up to 500 copies printed at a time. So I'm willing to make those available to students or clients at cost just to get this word out. So just so you don't think, I'm not about making money, it's about making a difference. I got a nice pension. I also have some Facebook pages I created. One's called Mental Health Education for America. It's your choice how you want to feel. Well, it's for the whole world. And I also have another one called Mental Health Education for Mesa County, which is the county I live in Colorado, and beyond, which means anywhere else in the world. And if you ever have any questions, my email address is naturesmasterpieces@yahoo.com. So I'm done, Doctor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you very much. It's a fantastic talk. I feel that a little fast, I think. Even then, it's so informative, and you explained very nicely what is responsible and responsibility, and what are the different ways of solving such things. And you are explained about the UAA, so UOA, that is unconditional other acceptance and unconditional self-acceptance. What is the difference between that two things? And also explain how anger, shame, guilt, depression, and loneliness can be solved very easily from the upper level to lower level. Means whatever thoughts we have based on need, necessity, and say demand should be come back to don't care state. Once it is in a don't care state, automatically the process, the threat will be much lesser. So that's a very good way of presentation. And you explain ABC model with some 2-3 more additions. I hope you are design something like that.
Just so I want to give credit where credit's due. That event, think, feel, do formula actually comes from a program called Active Parenting.
Yeah.
I can't remember who developed that, but it's a very good program for parents, teaching them how to manage their own emotions. It's called Active Parenting. Been out for a long time, probably 40 years.
So that formula is also very nice. How it is correlated with the ABC also you explained well. So thank you very much, sir. It's a wonderful talk. It's very nice to be here. Thank you. Anybody has any comments? Yes, thank you, sir. And Mr. Pat also, you can also comment. Mr. Pat, Mr. Matt.
Matt, are you there?
Yes, hello. Great.
Yeah.
Yes. Wonderful. Yeah, Ray and I agree on how this works, and he just uses completely different language, and I love it. I was taking notes this whole time as fast as I could. If you could provide your PowerPoint, that would be really helpful because I was trying to take screenshots. I can't do it fast
Oh, okay.
enough.
Well, we recorded. I
mind?
can make that available to Matt. Matt can send it to you, Doctor. So yeah, sure. I
That'd be
want
great.
you to, I do that as a, I use it as a script because I want to have economy of words to get through this as fast as I can, cover as much as I can.
Yeah.
But I also make that way somebody can go back and just go through it on their own very slowly and analyze and think about something rather than just see it once and never see it again. So I'll definitely make it available to you.
The presentation is
It's
also very
not,
good.
it's,
PPT is also very nice. Yes, sir, please. Matt.
yep. It's not particularly complicated. It's not complicated, but it's there's a lot to it. There's a lot to it. There's so much we don't know. So I do just like you. I just was on here what, a week or so ago, and same thing. I talk is going as fast as I can, doing as many slides as possible, and I never get through them all. You did good getting through them all. There's so much we want to say.
Oh yeah, there's a lot more. But
Fascinating.
that's the basis. You build a foundation and you build on it.
See, both
And
the
the more-
student, see, both the teacher and
more I-
students, both the teacher and students are, student is very nice in presentations. That's what. Okay.
Yeah, the more I've gone through life teaching and everything else, the more I realized how spot on Ellis was, how he really identified what's really the problem. He just nailed
Yeah.
it. I mean, people start to think they need things they simply want, and then they awfulize, tell them something they can't. It's just, he nailed it. He summarized it in such a simple enough way to be good. So, and it's something that can be
Right.
easily be taught to, and I taught it to 14-year-olds. You can teach it to junior high kids. You could probably, there's even a way to teach it to younger kids. It's called rough spot training. Where you just teach them cool thoughts and hot thoughts. They're basically teaching them very early that it's really your thoughts that determine how you're going to feel and ultimately behave. It's not what those other kids say and do. So it's called rough spot training.
That's cool.
Okay. Then
You have a
Raju
question
Phillips,
in the chat.
Can you come in? Raju Phillips, sir, can you
Okay.
come in?
Good.
Unmute, sir, unmute. Please unmute.
Good evening. Thank you, Sabu sir, for the opportunity. Sir Ray Mathis, your presentation was wonderful, great. It
Thank
was
you.
very comprehensive and it was very integrative. And actually, as Sabu sir was complaining, it was rather fast because we are not original speakers of English. You had so many these slides, and you are just changing it very fast. You are trying to read it before completing it.
That's why I'm going to make it available to you, because I know I go fast. Yeah. And I'll even, you can make a lot, like for example, the think, feel, do thermostat. That's easy to make one in Microsoft Word. You have the tables you can create. They're very easy to create. You can modify it any way you want to, but it's a good model. I think it's very, a picture's worth 1,000 words. If somebody has a visual in front of them, it's a lot easier to explain a concept to them. It's a good way for them to evaluate. I might put that in front of somebody and say, where are you right now? Where are you feeling? Are you, frustrated, or are you angry? And what's that tell you about where your thinking is at? It's a very good way to help somebody self-evaluate.
Yes, sir. You are included so many tables also. That's right.
One of the things I want to apologize for is I have an auditory problem where I have trouble when someone has an accent. So I was very terrible in foreign languages. I hate it. My wife is a foreign language teacher, but even when our grandkids talk, sometimes I can't understand what they're saying and everybody else can. So if I can't understand what you're saying, it's not you, it's me. It's
Yes,
an
sir.
auditory problem. I don't know what they call it, but that's why I was never good in foreign languages. But so sometimes
Yes.
if you have an accent I'm not used to, I may not hear and understand what you're saying, but please don't be offended. It's not you, it's me. So
No, sir, it's not an accent problem. It's only a speed problem because you're changing the slides in a little faster way. That's the only problem. Anyway, it's very nice, sir. Raj sir,
Yeah,
please continue.
just only I was telling the improvement, but actually it was a really great session. We enriching content was there, and you have we had many takeaways from your session. Actually, about the ruts made in the brain by your practice, daily practice. We cannot solve it. You have to make new ruts. It's a great thing by practicing new things.
Yeah, when you think about it, it's like what governments do with streets in a city. You know, sometimes you'll have old ways and traffic jams and everything else. So they create new ruts. They create new streets and new roads that allow people to go a different and hopefully better way. But the problem is those old roads will always be there. And sometimes you might, on your way to work or school, you might accidentally go the old way and get stuck in traffic again. Well, you just turn around and go back and take the new way. You know, it's very similar, very analogous to what goes on in the brain is what we see happening in cities when they build new streets to make traffic flow better for everybody.
Okay, you rightly said that the most awful things we are just imagining in our life. As the French philosopher has said, my life has been full of terrible misfortunes, but most of them never happen. We are just imagining something awful is going to happen. This is the main problem for making our life very bitter and very awful. You have said it rightly, and thank you very much, because we Keralites are very good in physical health, but we are not good in mental health. You have said many things to optimize that mental health. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much for your great presentation, and congratulations.
Thank you.
The same for conducting this session by Sabu sir. Welcome.
Okay, Shaji sir, can you speak something?
Okay, Matthis sir, your presentation has been wonderful. You included number of points in it. So I took screenshots of all the slides so that I can go through it again to understand it in full. Sabu sir, it's your great intervention that helps us to have all these kinds of presentations. So people behave very strangely and naturally. There is the need for this kind of REBT, CBT treatments like that. Many of us don't have common sense. Naturally, we don't know how to do things properly. That causes so many disturbances in our society. Anyway, sir, your presentation has been so far-reaching to us. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Please, I can make anything I have available to you. You're welcome to anything. Use it as much as you. The more you can spread the word and help other people and help yourself, be my guest. You're welcome to everything I have. It's not about making money. It's about making a difference.
Yes,
Can you tell again the name of your book?
It's your choice how you want to feel. It's if we make the we can make that'll make the look, it's your choice how you want to feel. It really is. Here's why. It's on Amazon. We're going to try to make that PowerPoint available, right, Matt? So yeah, we'll make it. Somehow we'll find a way to post the PowerPoint so everybody doesn't have to, figure out what they just saw. So.
Okay, anybody else is there? Anybody else to have some comments? Anthony sir is there? Answer sir, please.
Sir. Sir. Ansarya.
Please speak, sir. Yes.
Actually, see, sir, you have brought a very wonderful person here, but the thing is that we are not native speakers of English. So only here and there I couldn't follow because of your speed and also some accents I can't. Before I consuming, you are telling the other word. So we are not native speakers. All of you know that one. That's the problem we are facing. But anyhow, here and there, I understood many things, and it's some theories and how you can implement in our life. That is it. Very good, sir. I am surprised to see that such big, great people are brought by our friend Mr. Sabu. Where did he bring all these people? I actually congratulate you, sir, for this one. And you have spent a lot of time and lot of energy for preparing these slides, because it's full of content only, nothing waste there. So it's full of points, and this one actually we should refer and see that one again and again 2-3 times. If we go through it, we can, to some extent, we can understand it. Very good. Come again and help us to give such certain, so that our communication skill also develop, because we may able to hear some words, or the actually the native speakers, if they come the use of proper.
Lost them.
Okay.
Yeah, one of the things I've always encouraged people to do, I'm sorry.
Yes, sir.
So one of the things I've always encouraged is, in schools, what often happens with mental health education is they'll take teachers and they'll hand them this activity from some canned program that somebody else developed. Teachers don't know what they're doing. What I always encourage teachers to do is learn this stuff for yourself. Learn to have an internal locus of control. Learn to manage your own thinking and correct your own identify and correct your own irrational thinking. If you do that, you'll be in a better position to teach that to young people. But if you don't really understand what you're teaching, which a lot of times is the case with teachers, it's not going to work. I think every teacher should be taught this before, as part of their professional training, to have an internal locus of control, to recognize their own irrational thoughts and correct them before they ever go into a classroom. Then they'll be in a better position to teach that same thing, to pass it on to their students. Because if they can do that with their students, if they can help them be in a better mental and emotional place, those kids are going to function at a much better level, and the level we want them to. The reason they can't in the first place is because they can't get into that right or best possible mental and emotional place. So it's the most important thing a teacher could do is to help a kid get to the right mental and emotional place. Once you get them there, they'll do all kinds of things academically. But if they're not there, they're going to struggle. So mental health education is the primary thing we should be doing, but we're not. Part of it is like the thing I used to run into all the time as a teacher is that people get real suspicious that you're doing therapy in the classroom. No, I'm not doing therapy. I'm doing education. We teach kids all kinds of formulas about how life works and how to use those to their advantage. Why not teach them event plus thoughts equals feelings and behavior? Why don't we teach that? That should be on every classroom wall in the world. And then every time something comes up, look at that and make sense out of what's happening using that formula. We neglect to teach that simple formula. It's almost negligence, or malpractice that we don't do that. And we don't teach it to teachers, and that's why they're in a classroom saying, these kids are driving me crazy. No, they're not driving you crazy. You're driving yourself crazy, which is understandable, but you're doing it because of the way you're choosing to think about what the kid's doing. Some teachers will see some kid do something or say something, and they'll laugh about it. Others go ballistic. Well, why is the difference there? Why does one go ballistic and why does the other one laugh it off? It's because of how they choose to look at things. And that's important. It's not the kids. They're just an event. The kids are just an event. So anyways, get off my soapbox.
Yes. Everybody is thinking about IQ. Nobody is thinking about EQ. That is a problem, basically.
Yeah.
Okay, anybody else? Anita ma'am is there? Anybody else can give some comments, please?
Yes, sir. Okay, sir. Very good presentation. It is first of all, we can appreciate Raymat sir. It is like a sunrise that we all get new energy from this session. Ray sir said that anger is emotional like nitroglycerin. Yes, that must be handled very hard to handle that. Then we also get the full form of USA, that is unconditional self-acceptance. Choosing to see anything you think, feel, say, or do have in the past and might in the future as part of the being human. And understandably, given what your life experiences have been and what you have to deal with that at a moment. Next, we get even the equations also, even plus thoughts is equal to feelings and behavior. That is a wonderful thought. Next, A plus B is equal to C. All maths and theoretical approach, he gave a good presentation. We can all appreciate his performance.
Yeah, Doctor, I think we really want to get the PowerPoint somehow to everybody and make it available to them so they can take their time and go through it slide by slide. And, you know, it takes a lot. It takes a while to digest it and to, you know, it's like anything else. You have to rehearse it in your brain and think about it for a while. And if we can make that PowerPoint available to them some way, they've got the video, but the PowerPoint would be a way for them to just go through at their own pace. And that way it would negate any language problems there might be.
So
Yes,
once,
sir, very informative.
once we go through one more time the PowerPoint, it will be more clear. That's the thing. That's nice. Thank you, sir. Anybody else? Anybody more? Somebody is there giving some comments. Okay. So thank you, Mr. Match. It's a wonderful speaker given to us, and we are expecting some more topic like this. Very informational topics on emotional intelligence as well as mental stability. Not only in USA, here also it is lacking emotional stability, even in not only for students, but all people. Generally, there is a lack of emotional intelligence and mental stability. So
Can
we
I say
are.
one more thing, Doctor? Can I say one more thing? You know, right now we're hearing a lot about there's places in the world where people are turning to autocrat or, you know, dictators and things like that. Well, when you think about it, that's largely because of having an external locus of control. Because if I think you make me feel bad, that also implies that I expect someone to make me feel good, which makes me vulnerable to a demagogue or a dictator or some autocrat. Or even, you know, that's why people turn to religion, because they're basically acting a god to make their life better, because they have an external locus of control. And it's not a coincidence that some of the same people in our country, the US, who are turning to a demagogue or an autocrat, like former President Trump, are also the most religious people, because they have an external locus of control that makes them vulnerable. So by teaching people to have an internal locus of control, we're actually making people less vulnerable to the whatever indoctrination of an autocrat or a demagogue. And if we want to get rid of that, we're going to have to somehow harden people against that. Otherwise, people, if they have an external locus of control, they'll always be susceptible to someone coming along saying, think about what Trump used to say, you know, I alone can fix it. Well, no, that's not true.
George, sir, please.
Yeah, so
Hi, thank you,
this
sir.
is really important stuff.
Hi. Mathis, sir, it is a great presentation, much contents, but I can't follow that PPT. It is in high speed. That's only my my feeling. Okay, sir, that useful information so much that so much. No, I will not take it one by one. Set our thing thermostat. I will set. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. And we'll make that PowerPoint available somehow. That's Matt's job.
Yes, I will get it. ആർക്കെങ്കിലും പവർ പോയിന്റ് വേണമെങ്കിൽ നമുക്ക് തരാം. സാർ അത് തരും. ആന്റണി സാർ, can you speak something? ആന്റണി പുത്തൻപറമ്പ്. Abdul Rahim sir. Okay. So thank you, Mr. Matt and Mr. Ray. It's a wonderful presentation today, and it is a great pleasure to be here with Matinee free webinar platform. So 2 people from USA. Yes, Tommy sir, can you?
Nothing, sir. Nothing to say. I have given something in the chat box. That's enough, sir. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Rai Mathis, sir. Very informative, and we got many things from it. I have taken some screenshots, and tomorrow once more I will hear it from the YouTube.
Well, make sure you get the PowerPoint and go through it slowly and just think about it. Think how every one of those points applies to your life.
Okay.
And, that's what you want to do.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you, sir.
So not only as a speaker in online, you are welcome to Kerala, India also. Both Matt and
Okay. We are awaiting you.
yeah. Please come over India, and Kerala is a wonderful city. No, or
That
state.
will be a grace for us.
All are welcoming, sir.
Yes.
It's
You know, what
God's
Matt
own
and
country.
I think Matt has found this too, is people in India are more, and even England and other countries are more receptive to what we try to say than people in the United States. People in the United States have this big thing about, nobody messing with my mind, so I don't want to hear all this. We're glad to talk anywhere we can, and spread the word. I'm getting older. I want to try to get as many people to figure this out before I leave this planet. And, Matt's doing the same thing, so.
So we are in a, I don't know states.
I don't like to fly, so.
So
We're
we
gonna
are,
have to
we are
build a
general-
bridge. We have to build a bridge over the Pacific Ocean or something.
Yes.
I'm not big, I allow myself one thing to be irrational about, and that's flying, so.
So anyway, we are heartily inviting you both of to India and Kerala. Find time for that. Prepare everything, and come with other topic also. We are waiting for another topics also.
Okay.
Okay. And
So
keep
thank you
going.
very much.
It's
Okay.
great.
Okay. Thank you very much, and good night. Tomorrow we have a session on gestalt therapy
Right.
by Ravina.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
I
Good
see.
night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you all.
Okay.
Good night.
Bye-bye.